Good morning, everyone. Today we will be taking part in a session surrounding juicy sentences. At the root of juicy sentences, we are looking at defining what syntax is, why it's important, and what does it have to do with juicy sentences. What is a juicy sentence? How can these tools be used in our classroom? So before we jump right in, the first thing I want you to do is look at your 1818 handout. Get familiar with the definition of syntax that is there. And once you're familiar and comfortable with it, I want you to paraphrase it. Put it in your own words. Define what syntax means. How do you interpret it? You're going to do this at your table, and we're going to be prepared to share out. I'm going to say we take about 2.5 minutes. Read that definition over, get familiar with it, paraphrase it into our own words, and then be prepared to share out. Okay, now that we've taken the time to do that, let's revisit. What is syntax? What is it? What does it mean? Okay, so in the handout, syntax is defined as being a root word from the Greek language that means joining several things together. Okay, joining several things together. So with that in mind, I want you to share out your idea. How did you interpret the definition of syntax? Okay. So this idea of syntax, joining sentences together, joining words together to form sentences, putting pieces together so that we can clearly communicate our ideas that are both spoken and that are both written, is what syntax is. And this usage of syntax can vary from circumstance to circumstance and situation to situation. So what do the experts say about syntax? So syntax is kind of like the root of a sentence, how we put those pieces together. If you look at the quote by Marilyn Adams, it says, trying to read without syntax is like doing math without the operation. With no syntax in a sentence, you don't have a sentence. Okay? So students who have trouble with defining main idea from subtopics, they have a hard time understanding what the speaker or what the writer is trying to convey to them. And the reverse happens as well. If students struggle with using syntax in their written work, then they struggle with communicating clearly. And if you look at the research that was done by Tim Shanahan, it shows that there's a clear relationship between syntactic or grammatical sophistication and how we comprehend what we read. They go hand in hand. They are not separate from one another. If we don't use syntax correctly in our reading and in our writing, then we struggle to comprehend the messages that we are trying to present, as well as the messages that are given to us, both spoken and written. When students are able to use syntax correctly and make sense of it, then they improve in both their oral communication, their written communication, and their reading comprehension. So that brings us to this topic of today. Juicy sentences. All right, juicy sentences. What's a juicy sentence? Okay. So juicy sentences are just what they sound like. They're sentences with complex words, complex ideas. They're trying to present a message. Okay. So they are complex sentences in a more complex text, but these sentences are juicy because they're critical to understanding the text. Think about a book that you read, whether it was in middle school, whether it was in high school. I'm remembering something that I just read and worked with students recently, The Cask of Amontillado. Some of that I was reading with kids, I was like, man, I haven't done this in forever. What the heck is he talking about? And the whole idea of the story was revenge. But some of those words and syntax and grammar usage, it was so complex. So we had to take it step by step, break it down. And that's what Juicy Sentences teaches you to do with your students. Okay? So these are complex sentences in a complex text that's critical to understanding the meaning, the idea of the text. It's typically confusing or unusual syntax usage, and these things are worth unpacking with your class because they help students, they support them in understanding what the text is trying to convey, what message is being taken away from what is being spoken to them, or what is being read to them, or what they are reading on their own. These are teachable moments that are supported by language and reading standards, and they are strong skills for students to emulate. Any questions about that? How do we decide which sentences are juicy? I mean, think about some of those complex texts. Think about The Poison Tree. I don't know if any of you have ever read that, but boy, some of that poetry by William Blake, I'm thinking back to college. I'm like, man, I'm doing this with my 8th graders? What the heck? So think about some of those stories you read. Think about something you read maybe recently in your class with your students. Anybody want to share out? Okay. All right. So think about those texts, okay? Think about those texts and think about some of the sentences. Visualize that in your head. Some of the sentences in those texts, okay? Because that's going to help you understand how we select which sentences are juicy and which ones we just are like, we'll get to it, okay? So there are a few considerations you should take when you are selecting a juicy sentence, okay? First of all, you need to know how important this sentence is for understanding the central idea of the text. Okay? Look at the language. Is there academic vocabulary used in that sentence that's going to be crucial for student understanding? What's important about the way that sentence is structured? Is it the alignment to a language standard? Is it something you feel like students could benefit from? Maybe something they've been struggling with. Okay? And how is this going to be linked to writing that your students are working on? Think about if you're working on a narrative. Is there a complex narrative sentence in there? Thinking about if you're working on research-based writing. Is there a complex research sentence in there? How is this going to align to the end product? Any questions about that? Okay, so when we're thinking about selecting these sentences, let's start thinking about some of the students in our class that may be English language learners, okay? And as we think about that, let's think about your session on reader and task consideration, okay? How can you select sentences with those learners in your mind while still considering what you learned in the reader and task consideration? So in this next segment, you're going to be observing how juicy sentences can be used with English language learners, okay? So there are a couple of things that you should do as you're watching, okay? 1, be present. 2, stay in the moment. 3, take notes if you need to. And as you watch, take note of process that allow for entry points for students across the continuum of reading and writing proficiency, how these processes align with language standards, and how this process adheres to the equity and principles of language and for learners, okay? This is a sample of a class that is reading A Long Walk to Water. This is a group of 6th to 8th grade English language learners, and the teacher is actually a facilitator at an institute, and she is still working in the classroom. She's made great strides using this routine with her students, and be prepared at the end to share your notes, your findings, your work with us, please. All right. So, as you work through those columns, okay, let's debrief, how does this activity address the principles of equity? So we're looking at amplification of language, developing content in language, and well-structured opportunities for students to practice these things. Okay, how does Hannah scaffold for students who are struggling with reading? What are some things you noted that she did to scaffold this activity? Okay. So this whole idea of juicy sentence usage, okay, is that for the amount of time it takes, the benefits are super extensive for students, okay? The protocol, the practice, it builds closer reader connection and reading skills, transfers those same skills into their writing. Notice how they listened. They read together. They read on their own. Then they paraphrased. They were constantly practicing the use of the language over and over again to get familiar with it, to get comfortable with it. And as students mimic this structure over and over again, they get more precise in completing this on their own. And that's the goal ultimately. So what does this process look like? Okay? So as you look at this slide, I want you to note that what the teacher does is to the right, and what the student does is to the left. Okay? Students are going to rewrite and paraphrase the sentence. They are going to write what the sentence means, what the sentence is trying to tell us, write what they notice about the sentence. And then they're going to rewrite a new sentence using the structure of the sentence that's already presented to them. Okay. Okay. So why should we do this process? Okay? What are the equity, the standards, the instruction? So you're going to jot down the first 4 bullets, and then you're going to identify their role and kind of brainstorm the answer. And when you're done, you're going to engage in a journal reflection as well as a turn and talk. And we're going to take about 7 minutes or so to share out these ideas, okay? My name is Latoya Nelson. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to working together soon.